China has downgraded its COVID-19 response, and a sense of normalcy is returning to people's daily lives. But some countries don't seem to see it that way. The US, the UK, India, the Republic of Korea, and Japan have imposed restrictions targeting travelers from China, despite recommendations from medical authorities such as the World Health Organization and the European CDC. What do other countries think of this issue? I sat down with Ma Hui, Chinese ambassador to Cuba, a country which managed to contain COVID-19 despite decades-long embargo imposed by the US. Having served both in the UK and in Cuba during the 3 years of the pandemic, how does Ambassador Ma see the gap between realities on the ground and how they are portrayed by some media? Ambassador Ma joined me from Havana, Cuba. Your Excellency, thank you very much for joining us. First of all, on 8th of January, China officially downgrades the control measure of COVID-19 from Class A back to Class B. In simple terms, that means China officially opens up international travels, both inbound and outbound. What is the measure that the Cuban government has taken based on this change?
Certainly, January the 8th is a milestone in China's fight against the COVID-19. And the Cuban government actually welcomed the adjustment of China's COVID-19 prevention and control measures. They have always said that they welcomed Chinese visitors. And this will offer a good opportunity for Chinese visitors to come to Cuba to enjoy the so-called Pearl of the Caribbean. And the Cuban government has made it very clear that Cuba will not introduce any additional measures against targeting Chinese travelers. Right now, Cuba doesn't require a PCR negative test or the vaccine certificate, but they will check randomly on arrival.
What is the ground? On what ground is Cuba adopting such a measure? Because we know in the United States, for instance, or Europe, recommendations were given that require inbound tourists from the Chinese mainland to show negativity in terms of COVID infection. Why is Cuba so relaxed and reassured?
To Cuba, it's a process. Cuba opened up in July 2021. At that time, they still introduced some control measures. For instance, passengers arriving in Cuba have to show a negative test certificate or to show that they have been vaccinated. Mm-hmm. But since November last year, they have given up on the new measures. So now they don't require that. I think countries' situations differ. And Cuba has always maintained that they are against the politicization of the pandemic. And they adopt measures that to all countries, and they are also against the discrimination on any tourists from any particular country. I don't think it is appropriate for some other countries to impose additional measures because China's position has always been that for all countries, the COVID-19 control or prevention policies should be based on science, should be based on facts. And especially, they shouldn't adopt discriminatory measures targeting any particular countries. And furthermore, they shouldn't politicize or weaponize the pandemic because after all, the pandemic is a health issue, not a political issue. So I think that's the difference.
What is the current status of situation in Cuba? We understand that Cuba also were hit rather strongly by the different waves of infection, but Cuba managed, under embargo by the United States, managed to develop its own vaccines and had a relatively robust based on a robust public health system, was able to vaccinate its population. Basically, as I last time checked, Cuba has one of the highest per 100 population percentage of people boosted with vaccination and with domestic produced and researched vaccine. So what's the current situation among the Cuban population in terms of COVID-19?
The current COVID situation in Cuba is pretty stable, and the infection rate is very low. Right now, daily reported cases are between, say, 10 and 30 cases. Of course, not everybody is tested because it's voluntary. And for about 5 months, there has been no reports of COVID death. Of course, it is also a process. Cuba reported its first case in, I think, March 2020. And then there is a wave of infection towards the end of 2020. And again, in 2021, since the middle of the year, say in June, July, August, and September, there was a new wave because of the prevalence of the Omicron variant. But as you said, the party and the government of Cuba has also always put the life of the people and the health of the people front and center. And the leadership attached a huge importance to the COVID prevention and treatment issue. As you said, that Cuba, against all odds, developed its own vaccines. And it's the only Latin American country that has developed vaccines. By now, they have already developed 5 vaccine candidates, and 3 of them have been put into emergency use. And the inoculation or the vaccination rate among the Cuban population is very high. It's about 90%. I think that contributed to the low infection rate right now.
As traditional friends, China and Cuba, of course, have done a lot in many different fronts, and definitely in the fight against COVID-19 as well. To your knowledge, what kind of collaboration have been going on between the government, and what is still happening?
I think there is one common point between China and Cuba, that is both our two countries attach huge importance to the life of the people and the health of the people. Hence, we put a lot of efforts into fighting COVID-19. In Cuba's case, of course, they put emphasis on the prevention, on the treatment of patients, and also on the vaccination among its huge population. The two countries have always supported each other. When the COVID-19 first broke out in China, the Cuban leader called the Chinese leader to express their support and offered their material support to China, despite their own difficulties. And later, when Cuba entered its, let's say, the second wave of infections, say in the June 2021, that was the time when I arrived in Cuba. And the Chinese government provided all-out support to Cuba's efforts in fighting the pandemic, including ventilators, oxygen generators, medicines, PPEs. So overall, we provided about 9 batches of support with more than 100 tons of supplies to help Cuba fight the pandemic. Yeah. And also both two countries are against the politicizing of the pandemic, yeah, the virus issue.
How significant is such collaboration against the backdrop of U.S. embargo against Cuba for decades? And last November, a UN resolution was passed by 183 member states of the United Nations, calling on the United States to stop its embargo. And yet the United States and Israel voted against it, with Ukraine and Brazil abstaining. Of course, China supports the ending of the embargo. How much of a struggle was it for Cuba to fight against COVID-19 under the embargo, and how did they manage to overcome the challenges?
You know that Cuba is not a big country and their resources are limited, and especially the U.S. embargo or blockade has imposed a huge sufferance on the people of Cuba. The Cuban people or the Cuban government say that the U.S. embargo, actually, it is another virus that's killing the Cuban people. Even during the spikes of the infection, when the cases spikes, the United States didn't lift or relax its restrictions, embargo on Cuba. So against all these background difficulties, Cuba relied on itself, and also with the support of friendly countries, they fought a hard a brief fight against the pandemic.
They even offered help to other countries. I mean, I remember seeing Cuban doctors arriving in Italy in the early stage of the pandemic to help others.
Yes, like China, Cuba has also a tradition of sending medical teams to developing countries and even some developed world to help fight disease and to promote public health. And it's one of the things that Cuba is proud of. During the pandemic, it sent, I think, 30 or 40 teams to over 30 or 40 countries.
Yeah, how do they manage that under embargo, not only to sustain itself, but to help others as well?
It's a difficult, brief, and heroic efforts. They somehow managed to get some raw materials and rely on their own technology. Cuba is pretty developed in their biotechnology. So they developed their own medicines and vaccines even before the pandemic. I mean, vaccines for other common diseases, not for the coronavirus. And during this process, they developed their own vaccines. So it's a heroic story for the Cuban people to put up the fight against all these difficulties and actually be successful in containing the epidemic in Cuba.
Well, if you read the international reports, it seems you don't read these kind of stories that much. I mean, there seems to be a similar narrative because of the different social system, I guess, that Cuba is accused, when the situation was the most difficult, Cuba was accused of not doing enough or failing the people. And of course, the Chinese government has always been accused and criticized for failing since the very first day of the outbreaks detected in China up till this moment. Ambassador Ma, you were also in the UK when the outbreak first was detected in China and until 2021. What was your observation of the kind of reportage or the politicians' voices, rhetoric when it comes to countries such as China and Cuba? Have they been fair and truthful in their portrayal of what's happening on the ground?
I think all those allegations or criticisms against Cuba, and for that matter also against China, are unfounded, and those are untrue. Actually, there is a saying that damned if you do it, damned if you don't do it. If you recall, we can recall, when China was adopting its dynamic zero COVID policy, the mainstream Western media or some politicians in the Western world are saying that China are curtailing on the rights of the people, those restrictions are not sustainable, and it's a threat for the global economy. But when China lifted those restrictions, now they are saying millions of people will die and the Chinese government is irresponsible, and China, again, is a threat to global economy. So, of course, that exposes the deep-seated bias against the Chinese people and the Chinese state, actually. And those are really unfounded, and we are strongly opposed to those irresponsible remarks and wrong accusations against China and Cuba. Actually, both China and Cuba devoted a lot of their resources to saving lives, fighting the pandemic, and protecting public health. And in the meantime, we made our own contributions to the global fight against the pandemic.
How do you look at the challenges that China is going through at this moment, trying to help the most critical and most vulnerable population as to compare to what was happening in, let's say, the UK when you were there as minister in the embassy? Do you think China was going a particularly messy period of time, or it was something that every country had to face? What was the similarity? What was the difference?
The Chinese government, of course, has always been very responsible by putting the life and the health of the people front and center, and devoted all our resources to saving lives and protecting public health. But those noises, those allegations from the Western media, including the British media, are very unjustified and very unfair. Actually, they not only failed dismally, but they lecture others who actually, like China, it has set up a good example of fighting the pandemic and also helping the international community in coping with the pandemic. Like China was one of the first actually to say that Chinese vaccines will be made a global public good. And we supplied more than 2.2 billion doses of vaccines to all over the world, including, as you mentioned, sending medical teams to help other countries fight the pandemic. So we believe that solidarity and cooperation is the only way out to fighting the pandemic. All countries should gather together. We are in the same boat, as the pandemic is a common challenge for all of us, for all the humanity.
Thank you very much, Ma Hui, China's ambassador to Cuba, joining me from Havana. All the very best.